Hello, everyone. Welcome to Avaya's Overcoming PTSD curriculum. I'm Andy Anderson. My partner Ike Allen and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of Avaya University. Avaya is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive resources. Thank you so much for joining us. Our fellow teacher, Rachel Grant, is here to talk with us today about taking charge of your trauma brain, the power of focus. Rachel is the owner and founder of Rachel Grant Coaching and is a sexual abuse recovery coach. She also has her MA in counseling psychology. She is the author of the book Beyond Surviving: The Final Stage in Recovery from Sexual Abuse. She works with survivors of childhood sexual abuse who are beyond sick and tired of feeling broken, unfixable, and burdened by their past, and she helps them let go of their pain of that abuse and finally move on with their lives. Thank you so much for being here with us, Rachel.
Oh, Andy, it's so nice to be here. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, our pleasure. I'm so delighted that you said yes and wanted to come talk with us about this because I know that you're
Yeah.
specializing in something that so many people have suffered from. So how did you get into this line of work? Like how did you become a sexual abuse recovery coach?
Yes, thank you. So, as life sometimes happens, you find yourself in a place unexpectedly, because I really thought I was going to be a high school English teacher and, set out on that path and was well on my way towards that and working in education and even working as a nanny for many years and just exploring, child development and these sorts of things. But along the way, in my own journey of healing, life, threw me a little bit of a curveball. So if we back up just a little bit and we go to my childhood, when I was 5 years old, my grandfather came to live with our family. And I was really excited about that, actually. My older sister and brother kind of didn't pay me much mind at that point. And so I thought, aha, I have a captive audience here. And I would run home from school and go straight to his room, and we would hang out and talk and play. And he really became a very dear companion for me in those years. And then one day when I was 10 years old, I was sitting out on the front porch with my grandfather, and I felt his hand reach around and touch my breast.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking in that moment that he just didn't realize it was just a mistake, just a oops kind of thing. And so I started to kind of wiggle and try to adjust so his hand would, move away. And he gripped a hold of me. And immediately fear, right? And confusion and dissociation. Of course, I didn't know that's what it was happening at the time. I just remember feeling kind of floaty and not quite all there. But my brain and my body was going into that reaction, right? Which is the beginning stages of PTSD, right? When we have an igniting event like that, an activating event. And I eventually kind of snapped out of it, and I jumped up and I ran inside. And I remember being just really upset and crying and confused. And still to this day, it always amazes me how quickly in a moment of trauma we begin trying to understand it. No matter what our age, it's like, why did that happen? What was going on? I don't understand. And we trying to put the pieces together about it. And of course, when we have limited knowledge as children, the things we come up with aren't really the actual reasons, so feeling like I must have done something bad, and maybe I did something to make him do that, and all of these sorts of things. And the abuse went on for some time, and it got worse. And then one day my mom just happened to walk by and saw what he was doing. And boy, she went into big mama mode like right away. She was out on the porch and she was like, "Get in here, Rachel." And she and my dad got him out of the house, within a day. And I'm always very thankful and grateful to my parents for that, because I've been doing this work for about 13 years now. And I've certainly heard plenty of stories where, that kind of support is not the case. But from there, they didn't really know what to do next, honestly. They're, and no fault of theirs. And we're not trained. This is not something that parents, particularly at that, in the 80s, were being really, taught about. And so I was left a little bit to my own devices. And, all of these thoughts were just sitting there, and day after day after day. And I began to really struggle in my teen years. And eventually I got into a relationship when I was 18, and that turned into an abusive relationship. I stayed in that for 10 years. And when we separated, we were married for part of that. We divorced. I remember Andy being in my new apartment with just like a lamp and a sleeping bag. And that was really all I had. Life had just come to a halt in a lot of ways. And I remember sitting there one night just struggling. You have those moments in life where you're like, oh shit, like, how did this happen? How am I this person? How is this my life? This is not what it was supposed to look like. And I felt really strongly in that moment, like, Rachel, you have got to get it together, like right now, or you are going to spend the rest of your life just surviving, miserable, hurting, in pain, repeating the same mistakes again and again. And so that moment is really what launched me. I said, okay, I've got to figure this out. And I just became so obsessed with trying to answer that question. How do I actually heal from sexual trauma? So I began reading everything I could. I did my master's in counseling psychology. I began to study neuroscience. And that's really when the pieces started coming together. And I realized, okay, I can actually take all of this information that I'm learning, begin to apply it, and create, strategies and interventions that would help guarantee that I wouldn't spend the rest of my life just surviving, that I would live and that I could reclaim my life. And so bit by bit, all of that eventually became formulated into what is now the Beyond Surviving program.
Mm.
And for the past, as I mentioned, 13 years, I've been working with men and women all over the country, all over the world, to guide them in their own journey from moving, as you said, from that place of feeling broken and unfixable to like, okay, I'm moving on and my life is my own now,
Mm.
and just living really powerfully. Yeah.
Oh gosh, I'm like kind of speechless over here. Thank you for
Oh,
sharing your just awesome, amazing story. I love it, and I know so many people watching this event have struggled with the same thing or something similar. So I just so
yeah.
appreciate your openness and honesty about what happened and how you healed and I guess got yourself to where you are today.
Mm.
So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things. I really was just trying to get my shit together, Andy. I wasn't really aware that it was going to, unfold into this work and become something that I would be spending, my life really focused on. But I'm so glad that it has, because as you say, there are so many, people in the world who are, I mean, it really is a pandemic. Sexual trauma is a pandemic. And so addressing what is going on and being vocal about that and having these sorts of conversations is so key to
Mhm.
helping more and more people heal.
So, like you mentioned neuroscience, and I know that
Mm.
that's a big part of what you do is, in the study of the brain. So, how exactly is the brain impacted when someone experiences a trauma?
Hmm. So, at the point of trauma, the brain is activated. That whole system of like freeze, fight, flight, becomes activated. And in that moment, that's a really good thing. We need that, in order to manage and to cope. The problem is that when we have ongoing, repetitious trauma, the brain starts to feel like it's just in an onslaught, of danger. And so the capacity for the brain to really negotiate what is a threat and what isn't a threat diminishes. Like the part of your brain, the thalamus, I call it like the bouncer of the brain. It's like hanging out at the door, like deciding who gets in and like, are
Right.
you going to the VIP lounge or not? you know it just, everything starts to get filtered as danger. Like, that's a problem, that's a problem, that's a problem. And so the brain becomes overactivated and is just in kind of, I often describe it as like switched on in a state of hyper alertness. And so that's why so many survivors of trauma feel a lot of anxiety, have a hard time settling down. The other parts of the brain that are impacted are like the corpus callosum, and this is the part of the brain that helps us kind of self-soothe, and the cerebellar vermis, which is all about, managing activation and these sorts of things. So we do know from actual imaging of the brain that parts of the brain become limited, damaged, smaller size, but we also know that the brain can heal and repair. And
Mhm.
this for me was like such the good news, because when I was in my own healing process, so much of that felt like, well, I'm just damaged goods. I'm this broken thing, and I'm going to have to find cute little ways to like cope and manage myself, but that's going to be the extent of my experience and my life. But as I began to understand how we can retrain the brain, how we can heal the nervous system, I was so encouraged by that, because it meant that I really could restore my sense of self, my emotional capacity, my ability to eliminate triggers, not be in a triggered state all the time, reactive all of the time, these sorts of things. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the like coping mechanisms too, because that's like, right, so obviously common among anyone who has had any kind of trauma in their life. The things that we do, the behaviors, personalities, things that we create in our life to cover up, our fear, anxiety, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little deeper about the brain. And I know in your work you talk about how if people increase their awareness, right, around what they focus on, what they pay attention to, this
Yeah.
can actually either decrease or increase trauma symptoms. So could you expand on that?
Yeah, so like if we do like a little game to start off. So Andy, pretend that you and I are standing outside of a room, and before we go in, I say, "Ooh, girl, I cannot wait to go inside this room with you because there is the most amazing cake in this room.
Mm.
It is scrumptious and it's delicious and it's vegan or gluten-free or whatever you need it to be. And it's whatever flavor you want. It's magical."
Mhm.
And I open up that door and I send you into the room. What's the very first thing that you're looking for?
That cake, baby.
Oh, yes. You were like, where is the cake? And you are so focused on looking for and finding that cake that
Mhm.
you don't even notice the gorilla sitting on the couch, right? Or
Mhm.
the diamonds hanging from the ceiling. Everything is about looking for and finding that cake.
Mhm.
Now, when it comes to cake, like, hallelujah, yay, yeah, yes, that's great. But what happens for survivors of trauma is that the brain is really being trained to focus and pay attention and to be on the lookout for specific things. And so, very quickly, this happens. It's like when I went and I bought my new blue Toyota, actually, very long time ago, like 2007. As soon as I drove off the lot, everywhere I looked, I saw a blue Toyota. I was like, damn, did everybody go and buy a Toyota today? No, it's that the brain immediately latches on to data that it perceives as important to our survival. And ultimately being able to scan a space and find my blue Toyota out of a sea of cars is important. It's how I get back in my car and home to Netflix, right? It's critical. It's critical, Andy. But over time, what we see in survivors of trauma is that hyper focus on danger, that hyper focus on maybe proving something about ourselves becomes a limiting belief. And so if we are constantly teaching the brain what to pay attention to and what's important, then what we are paying attention to shifts how we perceive what's around us.
Mhm.
Great example of this. One of my clients was very much out to prove and constantly looking for evidence that all men were manipulative. A real common outcome for survivors of trauma is that sense of distrust. And so one day, the guy that she was dating came over and handed her a bouquet of flowers. And she snatched those flowers out of his hand and threw them in the trash can right in front of him and said, "Look, I'm not the one. You are not going to do that with me. I'm not going to be wooed with these silly little gifts. You're not going to, twist me and confuse me." And, basically went off on him. Like, poor guy,
Mhm.
right? But more importantly, poor her.
Yeah.
That intention and that lens that was so focused on looking for manipulation caused her to miss out on this opportunity to receive love, care, nurturing. And so, one of the things that all of you who are listening can do is to step back and maybe even pause this for a moment and start to get curious. Like, what have you been out to prove about yourself, about relationships, about others? I mean, we do this with everything: sex, money, career, all of it. And just do a little inventory. You can use that prompt, "What I've been out to prove is," to start navigating towards and identifying and getting curious about the things that you are most focused on that are then shaping your experience and how you perceive situations.
Yeah, and I love that you gave that example of very like black and white thinking in the world of all men are like this, all women are like this, because that is so very common for people to lump everyone together after obviously an experience that you had or someone else had. Makes perfect sense. So you may have just answered this because talking about our limitations, but like, how can people who have survived, sexual abuse identify different belief systems that are limiting them from healing?
Yeah. Well, that question certainly is a great one to use. What am I out to prove right now? You can be in the middle of an experience and ask yourself that question. You can be stepping back from something. You can be looking at something in the past and like, what did I come to believe as a result of that experience? What do I now think I know? That's a really great question to ask yourself. Because of that experience, what do I think I know? Right? It's like, what is my perception now as a result of that? For example, being on the porch with my grandfather, I was a very cuddly kid. I mean, I loved, like, if there was a lap, I was in it, like, let's snuggle, let's get close. And I remember when I was doing this work myself, looking at that experience, what do I think I now know? That cuddling is dangerous. Now, this is an assumption and a belief that's come about as a result of the miscommunication of why the thing that happened happened. So then I can start to get curious about that. Is that really true? What would I like to prove instead? So as we begin to think about interventions, we can see that actually the only reason why we're really, really good at finding that blue car is because we're practicing it over and over and over again. But we can, if I go and buy a red car tomorrow, at first my brain's going to be a little confused, right? Like, ooh, I don't know. Wait, what color car are we looking for today? Right? But as I keep going out every day and intentionally looking for that red car, eventually my brain goes, oh, blue car, done. Delete, doesn't matter, not important. Red car, that's the priority. And so we can do this with anything. Like, this is the amazing thing about the brain. I can start to say, I can either go out and look for evidence that cuddling is dangerous and bad, and I will find it. I will find it. Or I can start to say, hey, cuddling could be fun. Cuddling could be exciting. And then I can start to look for and have those experiences. And then my relationship to cuddling will change, as it has. I'm an amazing cuddler these days, right? And so we have to be able to, yes, identify the belief system, the limiting belief by way of these inquiries and these questions. But then we want to really get on to the work of challenging that and transforming that.
Awesome. Thank you. I love that. I love your examples. They're really fun and, I'm sure relate to so many people. So like in your experience, based on having your own abuse as a child, what are your thoughts on, can people overcome PTSD? Can they live their life free of PTSD?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the what I often distinguish and I talk about is that there are stages of healing. And when I think about Beyond Survivor, like that whole framework came about as a result of a conversation with someone in which I was talking about my life, and they came back with this idea of like, hey, you're such a survivor. Like, it's really amazing, all that you've navigated and been through and made it through. And I didn't know it and he didn't know it, but I really lost it on him at that time. I didn't know that was going to come out, but it did. And there was like all this rage and anger and upset about that. Like, I don't want to just survive my life. That sounds terrible, right? Like, I want to live it. I want to thrive. I want to have an amazing life and feel good. And so what I often describe and talk with my clients about is what Beyond Surviving really represents at the end of the day is coming through this final stage of recovery. So recovery is a time in our life where we are really focused on and we really are navigating and working with the symptoms, and such as those that come from PTSD. but that we reach a place where this trauma is integrated in such a way that it is a part of our narrative, it is a part of our story, but not the story. And we can mitigate and minimize the symptoms. And so there are things that I used to experience that I never, ever, ever experience now, today in my life. They're gone. There are other things that come around every once in a while. So Beyond Surviving is also about, like, when something shows up, how do we respond to it? Can we decrease how often we get triggered or we are symptomatic, such that it's almost like a little blip on the screen, right? And if we do find ourselves in that moment, do we know what to do in order to come back into a state of regulation so that we aren't derailed, right? Like, it doesn't take us off into like this whole roller coaster adventure, for days or weeks or months, but that we have a really high capacity for resiliency and for bounce back. So there isn't, like, for me, in answer to that question, a yes or no. There's some things I absolutely see in myself and in my clients will stop. They just stop. And then there are other things that you will mitigate and that you will know how to navigate. But for all intents and purposes, the goal and the intention is to minimize and decrease how often that is occurring, such that it's almost like, you have a bad day. We all have bad days, right? I say to my clients, life is going to keep happening. I can't stop that for you, right? So things can come along, something can surprise you, but having that place of like, hey, I know how to respond to that empowerment piece is really critical. And that's almost more important than eradicating all of the symptoms.
So could you give some examples of like some of the things that you see your clients most often eradicate, and then some of the things that you see people more triggered by or have to continuously, maintain and work on?
Yeah, gosh, that's a wide landscape because everybody is so different, right? And so one thing that's like really sticks in my craw, going back to my country roots here, you can hear, but for another person, it's like, oh, got that done. And then something for me that's just, really, really gone sticks around. But I'll give you some examples of things that I've seen in my life and in my client's life. So fear of abandonment. This is a huge one that leads to a whole host of like trickle down behaviors and effects and choices and reactions and reactivity. So for me, my relationship to this idea of abandonment has so evolved that being in relationship with other people no longer holds all of the charge and the fear and the anxiety and the overwhelm and the constant rumination and thinking about, like, are they going to leave, and what if they leave, and how am I going to handle that, and what am I going to do, and what am I going to do to make sure that doesn't happen. And so that's really dissipated. And I see that in a lot of my clients. We really kind of nip that in the bud. And they're able to better just be present in their relationships and also be better assessors of risk. These are two really key pieces to dealing with that abandonment piece. One of my clients was very, very triggered by sounds, particularly sirens. And in our work, we were able to de-trigger that, right? And so ultimately now she's out and about in the world, and if she hears a siren, she doesn't have any of that reactivity that she used to have. Something that I've seen that can sometimes linger are belief systems, like particularly that perfectionist one. Ooh, Lordy, that's a tough one. And I think that's a tough one, not just because of trauma. I think it's also because of the culture that we're in, that's so performance-based and so all about attaching your value and your worth to your output and outcomes. And so I think part of the reason why some of these things stick in longer or are harder to maybe mitigate are because there are outside forces that we're constantly bumping into that make it much harder. So those are some things that kind of immediately come to mind.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I relate to, all of those, I think. So the abandonment issues, the loud noises, like that, the perfectionism, absolutely. So I'm sure so many other people can relate also. And it's wonderful and like hopeful in the world of that, right, really working through those abandonment issues specifically and being able to, like you said, nip that in the bud. That's a beautiful hope and inspiration for people, because that is so I know it personally. So it's very painful way to
Yeah.
live. And so, yeah.
Thank you,
Um,
Andy.
I would love it if you'd share a little bit about a gift you have for everybody, as well as a
Mm.
program, and then we can talk a little bit more on the topic. But there's a couple buttons below the video, everyone, that link over to Rachel's site. So what do you have for everybody?
Okay, so the first thing that you're going to want to check out is the 3 stages of recovery from childhood abuse checklist. So I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but one of the things that I've really paid close attention to in my work is trying to articulate what is it that we're actually working through at each stage of healing, and what are those stages. So I break it down into victim, survivor, and beyond survivor. And the victim stage is really just when you're kind of in that place of maybe denial. You're not quite ready to look at things, and you could potentially also still be being victimized. And the survivor stage is when you come into that place of acceptance and acknowledgement, and you're starting to do some more of that healing work and talking things through. And then the beyond survivor stage is really when you hit that, like, enough is enough. I gotta deal with this, and you're ready to really work on higher levels of intervention and personal growth and change, transformation. So in this checklist, you're going to be able to learn more about each of those stages as I conceive of them, and importantly, what are the goals? What do you need to kind of be focusing on based on what stage you're in, and what kind of support do you need to get? Because part of what I see happening out in the world of healing is that survivors, those who've experienced trauma, who are starting to seek resources, they end up with support that is misaligned, and they end up re-traumatized. So I really want you to have that landscape. And I break it down in this very linear way, but I want to name that, like, you can be in the victim stage around one thing in your life, like, nope, not looking at that, not ready.
Mhm.
And then you can be in the beyond survivor stage in another area of your life. You've really worked on it, you're clear about it, you're really thriving there. But breaking it down this way just gives people kind of a sense of what to look for and what to kind of expect.
Awesome. Thank you. Awesome. And again, everyone, there's a button below that you can just click on and head over to Rachel's site to get that free checklist. Awesome. And then what about your boot camp?
Okay, so the 28-day boot camp for the brain. For me, as we've been talking about, the neuroscience of trauma is so very key. Understanding what has happened to your brain and what you can do to heal it, for me, is like the bottom line that everybody needs to know and understand. And so in this 28-day program, I'm going to be helping you to really identify those belief systems, taking you through some very specific exercises so that you can identify your limiting beliefs, and then what kind of strategies and interventions are going to help you in transforming those belief systems, reducing symptoms of PTSD. I call it kicking PTSD to the curb, building confidence, coming into hope. I think is also a really big piece of this boot camp program, because certainly, so many people come to me, Andy, who are like, God, Rachel, I've been like in therapy for 20 years, and it, like, yeah, some things are better, but I still feel really stuck, and like my life is just still so wrapped up in trying to manage and cope and deal. And I sometimes describe it as like white knuckling it through life. Like, yeah, I get through my day, but it's like a lot of effort. And we don't want that. We want ease. We want freedom. We want peace. We want to thrive. So a lot of the exercises and tools and skills that you'll learn in the 28-day program are really about restoring hope, building confidence, overcoming triggers. And so that is a online program. When you sign up, you'll receive everything via email over the course of 28 days. You have lifetime access to that material. So if you want to slow it down or do it in 28 days and then go back and review and revisit, you'll have support from me by way of a weekly Facebook office hours. And for right now, this program is being offered on a sliding scale. So the minimum investment is $15. And again, I really think it's worth a ton more than that. But one of my intentions in my work is to really try to make sure that people have what I think of as like the basics, no matter what. And so that's one of the reasons why I really try to make this program super, super accessible.
Thank you. And we so appreciate that. That is a big goal of ours at Avaya, also very cost-effective things, inexpensive resources for people to get help, because it's so crucial and important that we're not white knuckling our way through life. So, right.
Yes,
Awesome.
indeed.
Thank you. I love both of those. And
Yeah.
again, everyone, there's those two buttons below, so you can click on those and check out Rachel's work. And here's a question for you. And this is really in light of what's going on in the world today. At the time of this recording, and by the time this releases, we are in lockdown, or maybe starting to come out of lockdown in certain areas
Yeah.
from COVID-19. And I know that, we were kind of talking about this before we started recording today, like how that can be really traumatic for people, especially people who already have things like PTSD and trauma. Any insights or hope you can share around that?
Yeah, what an unexpected thing that we're facing, this global trauma. So it's interesting because I think people are experiencing what is happening on these two levels. It is a global experience, and then it's the micro my experience. And I think sometimes we might have the capacity, like what I'm noticing in my own journey is like when I'm at home, when I'm in my own little world and kind of going through my own little day, I'm fairly regulated, right? Like, I'm cool. It's all right. Everything's going to be fine, you know? But when I step out into the world and I start walking by, shops that are having to change the way they do their business, and I see people wearing the masks, and if I get onto the Facebook or, the media resources and these sorts of things, and I'm more confronted with the global experience, from that space, then I notice way more activation. So one thing that I would just encourage people to try to think about is the separation of those, because the strategies that we need to kind of process what is happening on this global scale and our perspective and feelings and experiences and trauma around that, versus what we're feeling as an individual. I think separating those two can be really beneficial and looking at it through those two lenses. But coming right back to what we've been talking about today, the power of focus. Like, if we sit and we focus on all of the bad news, ooh, yes, like our system is going to be basically, we're telling our system danger, 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 danger. Like, the brain doesn't really understand you're reading about something versus you're experiencing something. The brain kind of treats it all the same. So we want to be really careful about activating our system, and so be really good about curating, what we're reading, what we're exposed to, what we're looking at. And without putting like a fluffy, shiny, no, there, everything's going to be great, spin on things, I think it really is important to tap into resources that keep you feeling like laughing. For me, laughter has always been one of the greatest sources of healings. So like John Krasinski's Some Good News on YouTube. Ooh, that is saving my life right now. Okay. And so, there all of these layers that people have been talking about, the fact that survivors of trauma, feeling trapped, the fact that we have people who are now, my heart quakes the most when I think about the kids who don't have any reprieve, who don't have any escape from the homes where they're currently being abused.
Mm.
That's where I get really shaky and really upset and feel a lot of anger and frustration in the sense of like, well, what can we do about that? You know, but so, man, I'm saying a ton of things, but it's all kind of spilling out at once, Andy. So,
That's right. That's good.
final thought, final thought.
Yeah.
What do you normally do in your life to maintain your health and wellness? I call them like protocols, right? So the things that help us stay in our optimized self, as Esther Perel would say. What are those things? Like for me, like it's sleep. Are you eating a healthy diet? Like we got to sometimes just come back to the basics and make sure that we are doing those little things that kind of bolster and cushion us and help us cocoon in a little bit of safety. Because if everything goes out of whack, then we're going to be way less resilient, and we're going to just be way more susceptible to triggers, and our symptoms are going to escalate and overwhelm. And so, be kind to yourselves, be compassionate with yourselves. Life is different right now, so we can't keep doing everything exactly the way we always would. But if we can keep an eye on what we're out to prove, what we're focusing on, and making sure that we're doing those day-to-day things that keep us healthy and sane, then I think we'll all come out okay on the other side, one way or another.
Awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate you touching on that. I know so many people are going to find that really helpful to hear amidst the interesting times. So are there any last insights, anything else you want to put out there for people before we wrap up, Rachel?
Yeah, I just want to say, for those of you who are struggling with these symptoms, please remember they're symptoms. They're not you. This is like, it's kind of a poor analogy. The one I usually use is if you catch a flu. Right now in these times, it doesn't feel as great, but
Right.
like you start to sneeze, nobody ever blames you for sneezing if you have a flu. You don't blame yourself. You don't shame yourself, right? So remember that these are outcomes and symptoms of an injury that you've experienced, and they are not a life sentence. We can heal, we can repair, and we absolutely can reclaim our lives.
Beautiful. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for doing this. You're
Oh, thank
amazing.
you.
I appreciate your sense of humor and your just like light and, beautiful personality. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Andy. It's been such a joy connecting with you. And for everybody listening, thanks for tuning in. And I certainly look forward to connecting, and happy to be here as a resource and support however I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Bye, everybody.